Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada, Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Good morning. I mean, good evening. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. We've got a warm week coming up, mid to high 20s, and then it's actually moving up to low 30s on Saturday. So it's certainly a bit of a change. With spring, it probably feels like it's a step jump of at least 5 to 10 degrees. There you go.
Well,
And
a major
sorry.
dump of snow down in the southern part of the province, but I think we'll be spared here.
Oh, okay, righto. Isn't that interesting? The southern part, but
Yeah.
north the snow's not there, and that's the nature, I guess, of weather. The patterns aren't consistent, but
No,
they're
it's the nature of the way the wind spills over, the weather spills over the Rocky Mountains
yeah,
in that part of the province and
hmm
brings some pretty extreme weather sometimes.
yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And brother Robert Klinck. Now you may have noticed, ladies and gentlemen, that Robert's image is intermittent, but we do have a reasonably strong audio link. So welcome, Robert Klinck.
Good to be here in voice at least, Arnie.
No worries. Pleased to have pleased to have you, Robert, for a second there. I thought your voice had dropped out as well. Okay, welcome to you both. No worries. All right, the title for today, equality. My thoughts on the title was that we had a go at this forum last week, but the actual word equality, without the hyphen, is a misnomer. It actually means the opposite of quality, the opposite of discernment. And so I wanted to emphasize quality. Choosing, whether it's choosing a jumper, a shirt, a tie, a pair of glasses, a TV. If you're into horse racing, a horse, we're coming up to Melbourne Cup in a month or so. All of these things, a motor vehicle, a home, a place to live, all of these things we discern. And so we're actually discerning quality, constantly discerning quality. And yet the word equality, to say that we are all equal, of course, is absurd. It means that there is no quality at all. Wallace Clink.
Yes, if you say that in a general sense, that's true. It's an absence of quality. And of course, the ability to discern quality is to discriminate. And of
Mm,
course, the word discrimination has a bad name these days. And of course, the dangerous thing about it is that if you lack or try to discourage discrimination, you're actually interfering with the intellectual ability of the individual to differentiate. And if we can't differentiate, we can't live. It's the ability to differentiate
mm,
between various elements that has allowed us to not only to live, but to survive and to advance as a culture.
mm. Yeah, no, I think that's a very important observation, Wally. I know that Eric Butler, in his when he was giving a paper, he would often use the illustration with a picture of a bottle
Mhm.
containing a pink powdery substance that's identical to pink icing sugar. And he said, so you've got to be very careful. You've got to be able to discern the difference because the substance he was presenting was possibly strychnine. And if you can't discern the difference, if you can't determine that one is a very aggressive poison and the other is something that you could probably eat spoonfuls without doing any immediate adverse harm, except for maybe a bellyache. So I think discernment or quality, observation of quality, is an absolute vital consideration. And discrimination is a very, very important word because that's how you determine quality. Robert Klink.
Well, exactly. Equality means the absence of quality. It means out of quality. And in effect, it means sameness. And sameness is something we do not find in the world, as far as I can see. We know that no two persons' fingerprints are identical. No snowflake is identical to another. You can distinguish faces. You could probably distinguish all 7.5 billion of them. because there are no two that are identical. So the rule in nature and in our environment is not equality. And when people are setting equality as a goal, they're actually being dominated by a completely unrealistic abstract concept. Nature is dynamic as well. So even if there were some kind of equality in the world, because things change, it wouldn't be a static situation. It would be.
Yes, that's right. I think you've just dropped out, Robert, but I gather your point that in nature there is no such thing as equality or no quality, but rather you are able to discern the difference between things if you continue to look at them sufficiently. And that discrimination or discernment is vital, because if we're to consider the many decisions that we make every single day, and this actually brings us to the point of where do you actually place equality into, if you like, our real world? Where do you place equality? And I think that it's fascinating in our legal system that if there's a comment I heard or read once that if you lay the law down the same for the lion as the lamb, it's a tyranny. It's a tyranny. And so in the observation of law, especially in the courts, the considerations are taken into account before sentence is given as to the, if you like, the differences between the lion and the lamb. And that to me is fundamental. Fundamental that even law, even under law, would you hold someone accountable, and would they be equally accountable based on what they do or don't know, their age, their sex, their orientation, their philosophy, their place in time and space, all of these things. And of course, it takes discrimination or discernment in order to differentiate. So to me, it's very, very important. But I believe that there are at least two areas where we may consider equality. We may consider it. One is the vote. And your thoughts on the vote or other things, Wally Klinck?
Well, certainly, Arnie, the question of equality, you can seek equality, for instance, on a production line. But even then, it's only a temporary equality because you will always be endeavoring to improve the quality of your production process, right?
Mm-hmm.
You will maintain or try to maintain equality for a period in order to achieve a practical and useful result. But even that is subject to alteration with future developments and future refinement.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you're right, an equal law for the lion or the lamb. We do have, in the interests of fairness and justice, we do differentiate in some ways for different situations. For instance, was an act of violence provoked, or was it just simply born innocently? There are all sorts of considerations that come into these matters, but to make equality as a general rule about human beings, their nature, and so on, is completely unrealistic. And if you try to enforce it, you're trying to enforce something that is an abstract concept. And if you're going to do that, as we said, you have to, the only way you can do this in society is through force of law. And if you're trying to do something by force of law that is fundamentally unrealistic, a violation of natural law, then you will be perpetually attempting to govern or dominate people's behavior on the basis of an abstraction, which will just simply result in a continuous incursion on their freedom and their appropriate rights as individuals. So the idea, for instance, this idea of equality has been brought into human rights commissions. And it is really, really a dangerous thing because it's assuming certain equalities which are not inherent in the nature of things. And it is trying to enforce these types of equality. And also, it is not only trying to enforce them, but it is imposing extremely punitive and harsh penalties where the individual is deemed by some kangaroo court
Mm-hmm.
to have violated their particular standard of behavior.
I think that's
It is really, it reminds you of the people's courts of the Soviet Union, where a bunch of very, very unpleasant and officious people who were not qualified in law just simply arbitrarily rendered judgments against people that they didn't like or who had been reported as being antisocial or anti-Soviet, etc. In other words, it gives the state a power that the state's simply not qualified in natural law or by right to have.
I think it's interesting you bring up the commissions, the particular part of the commissions that they play, equal opportunity or race or religion or sex or whatever, these commissions. And in actual fact, the outworking of them in law is one of positive discrimination. And I use that word from their own words, and it's not positive discrimination. It's actually affirmative, if you like, discrimination against a particular grouping, because that particular grouping may, by its own natural innate abilities or its development or its education or its philosophy or for whatever reason, it has an advantage over other groupings. For instance, if you ever look at the Olympics and you look at the 100 metres sprint for men and women, one is that men are able to achieve faster speeds than women. The second is that predominantly the most athletic and fastest people in the world are from a particular type of people. And it's not necessarily if you like, the Anglo-Saxon Celtic, but rather other races. They are faster and they are better at that. And there's no question about it. And so observing it. But if you turn around and say handicap those individuals, of course, then the spectacle is in my view, is found wanting. I find it, I guess, in a sense, it argues against itself. Discrimination, anti-discrimination, anti-this, anti-that. But in actual fact, the affirmative action or the positive discrimination or whatever else you want to call it is actually discriminating against someone else. And so they are an imposition of power over people. You've got to go back, I guess, to understand what is the purpose of them. Ultimately, what is the purpose of them? And it is to suppress thinking. It is to suppress discrimination or discernment. Wally.
That's right. It's basically to suppress human freedom. That's what it is. And therefore it is anti-cultural and it suppresses culture. The fact that you happen to disagree with someone, the fact that you may criticize them or their ideas or their activities does not mean that you hate them. Certainly in Christian theology, you dislike the crime or the sin, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you hate the individual. And as a matter of fact, I believe that the people who are responsible for initiating this human rights legislation actually are a little bit too conscious of hatred themselves. I think they're reading themselves when they do this. When they look at someone else and assume that they are being hateful, I think it's a mirror of what they are themselves. And so that's why they are so adamant about suppressing people from expressing an opinion which may vary from someone else's or from the alleged values of society. Now, I don't know what the values of society are. We have individuals and they all have, if they're free individuals, they will have certain variations of opinion on that. And if they don't, they're not free. I know Gordon, the professor from in
Is it
Canada. Who is,
Jordan Peterson?
yeah, Jordan Peterson has recently, I just saw him say that the human rights commissions, and he said it very definitely, should be abolished.
Mhm.
Well, I said that they should never have been established back in the 60s and 70s
Mhm.
because you know what's going on. You know what it's
Mm.
all about. If you have
Mm.
any understanding of strategy and intent, you know what is intended when an attempt is made to suppress the speech or association of other individuals.
Mm.
They don't, and they don't want to discuss it. They don't want to air the subject. They want to suppress it.
Mm.
And when somebody wants to suppress something without honest discussion and open discussion, you can be 110% sure that their motives are not pure.
Mm. That's a very interesting comment, Wally, because I've been reading recently two books or booklets by Jeffrey Dobbs, and they're on our website. One is the On Planning the Earth, and the other is The Local World. And I'm laying them out, putting them in PDF so that they're available for printing locally, if you like. You can just do that. In the On Planning the Earth, he's essentially circulating around the Tennessee Valley Authority as central planning and the green movement, the justification for it. And the outworking, of course, was in the end, the purpose behind it. In the end, the outworking was the atomic bomb and also the hydrogen bomb. And if you follow that thinking through, you'll realize that big money, big business, big industry is very much behind a lot of these things that are suppressing thinking, suppressing discussion, suppressing thought. And you realize that it's part of a bigger strategy. The discrimination courts, if you like, tribunals, which are no more than star chambers, the purpose behind it, we're witnessing it here in Australia, where it's a never-ending, if you like, ongoing litigation until there is capitulation. And because the resources available are firstly the tax funds that are released for the court cases, but then on top of that, of course, there's credit, there's new funds, loans, and all that would be made available to pursue policy, but pursue an end in itself. Its purpose is to suppress thinking, is to suppress speech, is to suppress discussion. Some of the court cases in Australia, in my view, are specifically about suppressing discussion, suppressing science and the discussion of science, suppressing the biological outworkings of particular lifestyles and things like that. These things. And what is an homogenous people? And why would you promote a type of arrangement over another type because of the particular benefits? All these are part of discrimination. They're a part of discernment, a part of identifying quality. Wallace.
Yes, that's right, Arnie. I think when you consider these matters, from a social credit standpoint, we're being driven more and more and more to larger businesses, corporations, and so on,
Mm-hmm.
because it is impossible for business as a whole to recover its costs without increasing debt. In other words, mortgaging the future in order to liquidate costs of the past. And of course, it means that the larger organizations are always swallowing up the smaller. And this means constant centralization of administration and power that goes with it. And that's the thing about social credit in wanting to initiate a dividend and falling prices. We want to transfer power to the individual citizen, the individual consumer. We want the consumer to have the sanction through his choice, his money vote, of actually directing the policy of production. Whereas today, when the power of credit is centralized, it tends to favor the powerful organizations. So there is just a dynamic there that works in that way from a technical standpoint. Then you have to consider the psychological incentive or desire for the centralization of power. And that is the other aspect of the equation. There's a question of a technical problem, and there's a question of a political or psychological will to dominate the situation, the scene, or other people. And so these are different aspects of the problem, and they're very, very critical to this survival and the well-being of civilization, because you can see that as power becomes increasingly centralized, decision-making is taken away from the individual, and the individual literally loses his ability to live his life. That's what it amounts to in the end. And we don't see that as the justifiable attitude toward the nature of human life. We believe that individuals are unique, they have talent, and they have qualities and abilities, and that those features or those qualities should be given a maximum opportunity to have free play.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting comments there, Wally, especially about the initiative, if you like, or the expression of individual expression of the uniqueness. And I see that most clearly in the creative impulses that different people have. And it's quite fascinating to observe it. And so this word equality, of course, is an absurd word. It means no quality. And it's essentially dumbing people down instead of promoting their initiative, their creative spirits. And it serves a purpose. And of course, the purpose being in that is that the suppression of the individual initiative is the centralization of power, the bringing to power. It has a purpose or an end point. And this is the other area that I'd like to place on the table that you've already alluded to, and that is the national dividend, Wally. And that is a right of inheritance, of community inheritance, if you like, vested in the individual. The national dividend is about inheritance of the cultural, if you like, history, accumulation of knowledge and wisdom that is placed in the hands of the individual by a money vote. That's what it's about, that they have sufficient money votes to at least sustain life, and if they have enough individual initiative, they can actually find expression in the economic sphere or in any other creative sphere that they choose to and find further reward. So it's not a puritanical perspective. It's actually one of, if you like, in my view, solidly grounded in the freedom of the individual. It places power back in the hands of the individual. So the answer to the issues of today, are they to be directed towards some type of world authority, of which the greater the authority, the more it makes a mess of things? Or are they to be a change of policy, redirecting power back to the individual? These discrimination courts are to suppress individual initiative. That's what it's about. To blackmail or threaten or coerce or cajole or whatever anyone who happens to be in paid employment. If they step out of line, they're under threat of losing their income base. They're under threat of losing their home, their assets, because without work, without an income, of course, those assets could disappear in a heartbeat through mortgages and things like that. So you've got to consider this is a very real outworking of a greater policy, the policy of centralising power. And to me, the antithesis, if you like, of this is where you actually come back to place it in correct relationship with the individual and with natural law. You've got to be free, you've got to be moral, you've got to be responsible. Understand that. And where these are in balance, there is actually an increment. If their freedom is too much and there's not enough morality or responsibility, then there becomes anarchy. So there's an imbalance that can happen within the relationship. You've got to find them in equilibrium. So it is with power. In our sphere of power, we have government. We recognise that we need government in order for us as communities to come together and achieve those things and to have essentially an acceptable standard. That's what uniformity, that's law, we need that. But power, or government, if you like, needs to be throttled. And that's why freedom or totalitarianism, there needs to be found in that space things like limited constitutional monarchy or limited republican government, limited, defined and limited, no more than is absolutely necessary. And where that comes into equilibrium, there you have freedom. Not not freedom at the expense of security, but freedom and security. Freedom and security. And that is where a limited government can achieve that. Security to the point where, okay, you're in a jail cell, you're secure, all right, but you've got no freedom. You've got to have freedom and security, and in that you've got to have an adequate method of, if you like, resistance to tyranny in your hands. So to me, this equilibrium needs to be looked at very clearly, and of course the trinity in the economic is the production, the consumption and distribution. If it's in equilibrium, there's an increment of association, and and to me that's quite beautiful to consider. Wally.
Well, you see, Arnie, that's the really insidious thing about the argument that goes on about economic justice for all people. The system does not work as it's assumed to work. The system does not provide enough purchasing power for the total product to be absorbed, and that only makes sense because we're producing enormously today through factors that have nothing to do with labor. So if you're going to insist that all things must be earned when labor is only a portion of the cost of those things, you obviously are getting yourselves into a very difficult position. I mean, the producer does not want and cannot have a great buildup of inventory. He produces to recover his costs in the process of providing goods and services. And he has to do that or he can't carry on. And that's the nature of the operation. He is responsible to those who have provided the credits for him to operate, and he has to make sure that they're returned so that another cycle can be resumed. Otherwise, his credit is lacking. And you see, the problem is it falls into the hands of totalitarian-minded people because they will say, well, capitalist system is no good, it's oppressive, it's exploitative. And it is, if it's finance capitalism that we're talking about, because we know that power and wealth is being centralized and centralized in a dangerous manner. So the problem is that there is a bottleneck, and the bottleneck is in consumption. You see, we have an idea of ownership. And ownership is necessary for us to be able to administer resources in an orderly and organized and efficient manner. You can't have some kind of a general uproar every time you propose doing something. Otherwise, nothing will ever happen. It's just chaos. So you have to have people who know what they're doing and who have the freedom, the security with the resources in order to go ahead and do it. It's the consumer who has to determine whether or not those producers should be entitled to continue operating on the basis of their performance, consumer satisfaction. And it's the ability of the individual citizen to partake of the product of industry that is the important thing. It's not the ownership of production. And the call for the ownership and administration of production by workers, that would be absolute chaos. You can imagine what would happen in a factory if the workers were to decide everything that was developed and everything that was administered. I mean, it would, and it's been proven, of course, in the Soviet Union and elsewhere to be extremely efficient. The reason that China has got a pretty high level of efficiency in many ways is because they've broken away from that communist state administered concept of the economy. So, so we have to be very clear. It's not the ability to control production, of worker control. It is the right of the consumer to partake of the product of industry that is the key to economic fairness and justice.
Mm.
See, in the one case, it involves the enhancement of the power of the state, and on the other hand, it involves the capacity or power of the consumer through his express choice to control production. He doesn't have to know anything about it. All he has to know is that he likes what's coming out at the end, or he doesn't.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't, that's the end of the process, because business cannot survive if the consumer doesn't like what's being produced in a free society. But in a state-administered society, the consumer doesn't have that choice. And of course, you have tyranny and you have inefficiency.
No, good observation. Good bringing it together, Wally. Are you there, Robert? Okay, no, we still don't have Robert. We're gone to 31 minutes, Wally. I'm going to call for closing comments and about equality, no quality at all. Wally.
Well, quality is based on freedom, because freedom involves the ability of the individual to make meaningful choices. In other words, to discriminate. If you can't discriminate, you can't make a choice. If a person has no ability to discriminate, probably he could be assessed as technically insane, because he can't think in a rational, constructive manner. You have to be able to discern differences in order to make qualitative decisions and to offer support toward equality. And if you don't have it, you will not get equality, and your quality of your life, the nature of your life, will simply be degraded to the point where it's no longer worthwhile. So we have to, it's a question of getting relationships properly. What is the relationship of the individual citizen to production? Is the relationship to interfere with production and try to tell a producer what to do in the capacity of consumers or workers especially? Or is it to accept or reject the results? In other words, experts have to be able to have their freedom to operate, but they must be on tap and not on top.
Yeah, well put, well put. Thank you, Wally. It's been an interesting discussion. I'm sorry that we're struggling with the comms line with Robert Klinck on the eastern coast of Canada, but it's certainly been an interesting discussion. Equality, no equality at all. This is Arnis Luks, Wally Klinck, and Robert at the Freedom Forum. Cheers.
Thank you, Arnie.